Hello, and welcome to Political Bedlam. Like, what is this, like episode 15 or something? We've done a lot of these.
This is 39.
This is episode 39.
Episode 39,
according to Cass.
I am infallible.
We got a guest in today, my favorite Wantland, Cass's dad, Tim.
That hurts.
Good to have you on, Tim.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
We're gonna talk some Oklahoma history here in a minute, but first we're going to run down a local issue. Cass brought this to my attention today, so Cass will be taking point on this.
So everyone who works for the state is awful and terrible. That's the story, and that's pretty much all that needs to be said. But no, more specifically, former Department of Health Attorney Julie Edsel faked getting emails from fake death threats to herself, got caught, got fired, and then it was discovered that she was offered a job by pharmacy director Chelsea Church, who said that if you can guarantee that there's be a pharmacist in the marijuana dispensaries, I'll give you a job and a nice pay bump. And when those limits came out last week, everyone was really unhappy, and to know that it's not even like they're stupid, they're corrupt, it confirms all of our biases about the state of local affairs, and I think everyone is, to put it bluntly, pretty pissed off.
What surprises me the most about it is just nowadays with just everything being on the internet and everything is so accessible, like, why would you think you'd be able to get away with this?
Well, they're old school, and Oklahoma's got a lot of corrupt people, and that includes the people investigating the people, and no one has enough money to do their job, so yeah, they probably thought they'd get away with it.
Though it's worth pointing out that she had plenty of money to do her job. I'm pretty sure her
yes,
salary is at $130,000.
No, it was clearly overpaid.
Yes, definitely. Oklahoma continuing to subvert the will of the voters.
Yeah, it's impressing. I've seen one of the best tweets. Oklahoma should be a reality show called "So You Think You Can Vote," because they are constantly. What was it last year that they tried to change? We tried to make penalties for offenders less intense. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I remember that. And
then the lawmakers tried and failed to repeal the ballot initiative. And then, of course, right now what we're going through with Question 788. And then, have you signed the petition? Are you going to sign the petition?
I probably will, but I haven't yet. Producer just showed me an article. Apparently, the Oklahoma AG is taking up the fight against the ban of smokable marijuana. The AG has said that the Department of Health does not have the authority to do that.
Yes, so there is some good news. Someone is fighting for the people. I'm at the recreational that's going to be on the ballot in November.
I knew they were trying to sign a petition for it, but I hadn't known the status of it. I had not signed it, so we might be able to update you on that later. Go ahead and cut to our guest. I guess before we get into some Oklahoma history, Tim, I got bad news for you. I don't know if you knew this, but your son is a dirty commie. And I wanted to find out where you were on the political spectrum to see maybe what contributed to that.
Well, I think after today, you'll know exactly where I am. He doesn't get that from his mother or I, so I think it skips a generation. His grandmother is a liberal kind of person, so I think that's where he...
But I'm not a liberal kind of person.
So maybe his great-grandfather was Karl Marx? Is that what you're saying?
No, it skips. So his great grandfather would have been right wing. So his great probably was left wing, but I don't know.
Answer the question, old man.
I'm not sure where he gets his political views from. I guess just to be defiant to me. So
yeah, a lot of that going around.
So where are you politically? If you had to assign a political philosophy to yourself, where would you put yourself?
Libertarian.
Oh, of course you would.
He's a good guy. He's a good guy.
Yeah,
my favorite Wantland, as I keep saying. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It seems like the apple fell really far from the tree on this one, as they sometimes want to do. Get it? Want to do?
Well, I got it.
That's pretty good fun. Well, just to start off with talking about history, you guys were talking a little bit about this at dinner. Your guys' tie to Wantland Stadium.
Well, Wantland Stadium is named after my great-grandfather, be Cass's great-great-grandfather, C.W. Wantland, who was...
Charles.
Yes, yeah, who was a long-time sports coach at back then Central Normal. He was head football coach and head basketball coach, and started his career at the University of Oklahoma as a football player, and also ran track and wrestled and played basketball as well. So he was kind of a jack of all trades back at the turn of the last century. And to make matters worse, I have a bachelor's and a master's from Central, so I can lay claim to being a Bronco from way back.
Go Chos.
Yeah.
Well, that is awesome. Well, let's talk a little bit about Civil War history. You brought me a nice little mini booklet about Civil War in Oklahoma. A lot of people do not know that some of the Civil War was occurring in Oklahoma. We are friends on Facebook, and every single day you post something new about history, so you seem like the go-to guy.
Yeah. Well, I told Cass what I would do. I'd start from the very beginning, so I'm going to. About 120 million years ago, Oklahoma was a shallow sea, and that's a inside joke. But I think what I really will start from is where Oklahoma starts becoming a part of the United States. In 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte was involved in a war against everybody in Europe, and he needed money. And he had this land over in North America, so he sold it to the United States. Thomas Jefferson was the president, the Louisiana Purchase. Much of Oklahoma was purchased by that sale.
All except the tip of the Panhandle, right?
The Panhandle was originally part of Texas, and Texas gave up the top part of their Panhandle to remain a slave state.
Of course they did.
And so for many years, the Panhandle of Oklahoma was just simply called no man's land. And it wasn't until much later that Texas didn't want it back, so Oklahoma ended up getting it. So that's why we've got a Panhandle.
It gives us a very nice state aesthetic.
It does.
So we're a good-looking state. Say what you will about us, but we look good.
Right.
We discussed it on an earlier episode. Some people say we're a pan, and then we also found on the internet that we are actually a cleaver lodged in the heart of Texas.
Well, I think that's the way to do it.
Here.
But and don't forget, we own all of the Red River. It's not like most rivers are the boundary, and it's between.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, the Red River belongs to Oklahoma, all of it, from the North Bank to the South Bank. So,
has there ever been a shootout by chance down there?
There's been several shootouts down there. It began in the late 1800s when Alfalfa Bill Murray, one of our more colorful governors, a very progressive governor, I think that Cass would appreciate. He wasn't governor then, but he had a lawsuit against the state of Texas as to Greer County, Texas, and Oklahoma. And the Supreme Court ruled in his favor, and so because of where the fork of the Red River is and how it was defined, and that kind of set the tone for the Red River being part of the state of Oklahoma, all of it, because it was an old treaty with the Chickasaw Nation the United States had. And then in the 1920s, there was even more exciting battle between Texas and Oklahoma. Texas built a couple of toll bridges on the river, and Alfalfa Bill Murray, now the governor, said, "You can't do that. We own the river." So Texas governor sent up the Texas Rangers to occupy the river, but Alfalfa Bill Murray did one better. He sent the 45th or the Thunderbird Division down there with tanks and chased the Texas Rangers off. And I think that's one of the many reasons the OU-Texas game is so important. That and the fact that Texas had alcohol long before Oklahoma did, and they went down to Dallas to drink, and that's true.
Also tattoos.
Tattoos.
And so... that's part of it, but as to the Civil War, like we were talking about, Oklahoma, or what will become Oklahoma, becomes part of the United States in the early part of the 19th century, and early on in the 1820s, they started building forts, Fort Gibson, Fort Washita, Fort Holmes, and a couple of others to kind of protect the new frontier of the United States. It went that far because Texas at that time was still part of Mexico. And then, of course, Texas later on gained its independence before it became a state in 1845. And if I've got that date quite wrong, I apologize. But in the mid-1840s. So something happened in the 1830s that would change the face of what would become Oklahoma forever. And that was the removal of what we call the 5 civilized tribes of the 5 nations. And that, again, changed everything. In 1830s and 1835 up to really 1855, the federal government, along with some of the state governments, wanted to remove, in particular, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Seminoles, the Creeks, and the Cherokees from their traditional homes in Florida and Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, etc., to what would become known as Indian Territory. And so by the time all of the tribes got here, and the last one to fully arrive were the Seminoles in 1855, then what you had was this giant land known as the Indian Territory of the Indian Nations. And it stretched from the east boundary of Oklahoma and Arkansas all the way to the Texas Panhandle, all the way north to Kansas, and of course again south to Texas at the Red River. And the 5 tribes began setting up shop here, if you will. They set up towns, and these weren't towns like, hence the term civilized Indians. I don't know, I'm going to date myself. There was an old movie.
We just for the record, we don't call them that anymore. They're
No.
just the 5 tribes. He's using
They're the
dating
5,
term.
yeah, they're the 5 nations, but I'm using the 1830s and 1840s term.
He's used for context.
For
Yeah,
context,
for context,
absolutely.
yes. So the civilized tribes.
It's obvious why we don't call them that anymore. I won't get into it, but I'm sorry. Continue.
Yeah, all
Continue.
right. Well, as you know, I'm a card-carrying member of the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, so white guy, I can say what I want. So there
That's
you have
not
it.
okay. All right, settle down.
All right, but anyway, they were. There's an old movie called The Outlaw Josie Wells, and Chief Dan George is an actor from the '60s and '70s, and he plays a Cherokee Indian. And he said the reason we were called civilized is because we were easy to sneak up on. And so they were removed and sent here to what would become Oklahoma. But what were these nations? They were Indian, of course. They had their Indian culture. But they also were Southern. They had slaves with them. They brought their hundreds and hundreds of slaves. They brought the Southern traditions that their white neighbors had in back east, across the Mississippi. And they, again, were very Europeanized, if you want to call that. They, for the most part, they wore European clothes. They had towns like their counterparts in Arkansas, Missouri, and Texas would have had. But they did have their own court system, their own money, their own justice system. The Cherokees, of course, had their own alphabet. So they spoke their language as well as the English. So from until the war broke out, and you'll be able to tell what side I'm on when I say the war between the states, you'll know that the tribes were kind of self-sufficient. The federal government was only there in the forts I mentioned, the previous forts mentioned, to protect them from the wild Indian nations of the West, the Cheyenne or the Comanche or the Kiowa. And when the war broke out, the Indian nations began to get a little bit uncomfortable, because what happened was the federal government abandoned all these forts. They left them all. And these were the protection. The Confederate government saw an opportunity, so they moved in and started protecting the nations of Oklahoma. And again, I know it wasn't Oklahoma then. And so they also were trying to court them to become allies. So that's kind of where that began.
It's very interesting. I never knew that. I knew that they were affiliated with the Confederacy, but I didn't know it was an attempt to get another ally.
Well, there were 3 main reasons the nations wanted to join the Confederacy. Like I said, first of all, the Confederacy took up arms to protect them. They manned these forts, Fort Washita in particular. And second, there was money owed to them by the federal government. The money stopped. The Confederate government said they'll start paying the federal money that was owed. And then thirdly, and again, I'm not naive enough to say who knows what would happen if South would have won the war, if they would have continued to honor their
If they had to continue to be benevolent.
Yeah, benevolent. But one thing they did do that the federal government of the United States never did is they offered them an equal partnership. And it is borne out during the war and during the treaty times of what they were going to do. First of all, the Indian nations here in what would become Oklahoma had 3 representatives in the Confederate Congress. So now they were non-voting members because they weren't states, just like Puerto Rico is today. They have a member, but they can't vote. Now they can introduce legislation and things of that nature. Secondly, along with that, they said, look, you guys can do whatever you want when this war is over. You can stay as you are now, you can become your own independent nation, or even come in as a state. The Choctaw Nation, for example, in the 1850s, tried to become a state.
Interesting.
But they were kind of rebuffed, not so much because they were Indian or Native American, but because they were slaveholders. And so the majority, which were not slaveholders, did not want another slave state to be introduced. And so that's one reason that they didn't get in. So
That's very interesting. I never knew that. I mean, it definitely paints a more sympathetic plight for the Indian nations joining the Confederacy.
well, and people don't realize this too, but also the territory of Arizona joined the Confederacy. So the Confederate States of America actually were, land-wise, were larger than the United States because it went from the Atlantic Ocean to the California border, and of course all the way up past the Mason-Dixon line because Missouri, Kentucky, and Virginia. And the southern states did a very good job of recruiting the nations. They really wanted them to be part of their country, and so they sent Albert Pike into the Indian nations, and he actually, one by one, got the nations to sign treaties with the Confederacy. And the last to do so were the Cherokees, and they were the most prolific, they were the most powerful, they were the richest, still are, and as far as Indian nations and even the United States. It's always between them and the Navajos, which one is actually bigger. The Cherokees obviously are the biggest in Oklahoma. And so John Ross, who was the principal chief at the time, realized that he was surrounded by all the southern tribes because they all officially joined the Confederacy. I want to make sure we're clear on that the Confederate States of America recognized the Indian nations as they seceded from the Union, and they were official members of the Confederate States of America. So this, Oklahoma, was a Confederate territory, and at least all the Indian tribes were.
What were the repercussions for the tribes after the Civil War during Reconstruction?
Well, if you want to jump to that, we can.
I'm
right
sorry,
now.
I'm
No. That's a good segue. Other than Virginia, no southern state lost land, but except for the Indian nations in Oklahoma. Remember, as I said, during and before the war, all of Oklahoma, except for the Panhandle, belonged to the Indian nations. Now, again, they were subservient to the federal government, so it's technically federal land, but it was their territory, it was their borders, their boundaries. There were other tribes here. The Osage were here already, and of course there were the Caddos and Wichitas were already here. But as far as the actual land goes, it belonged to the five nations. After the war, as punishment for their involvement with the Confederacy, there was a treaty called the Fort Smith Treaty in 1866, and basically all of western Oklahoma, which had belonged to the five nations, was taken away from them. Seminoles and Creeks went all the way to the Texas border before the war. Chickasaws and Choctaws had leased lands all the way to the Texas border down in southwestern Oklahoma. The Cherokees went far north. The Cherokee Outlet and the Cherokee Strip, which will play an important part in the land runs later in the 1890s, belonged to the Cherokees. They lost that land, so their lands were all moved basically east of I-35, and basically that's what happened. So they're the only people besides Virginia that, because of
they were the seat of the Confederacy, right?
Well, what happened with Virginia was in 1862 or late 1861, the people in the western part of the state seceded from Virginia.
Right.
They wanted to be in the north.
And they didn't want to secede from the Union. So and so they became West Virginia, and they were admitted as a state in 1863.
So the people wanted that. The only people who really, really lost land
was
you got to imagine race played a part in that.
Well, and again, I'm not going to be naive enough to say, well, had they stayed neutral during the war or been 100% Union, that they would have not lost the land anyway. I mean, there was talk, for example, that's another reason the Choctaws were so vehement about trying to become a state, trying not to be part of the federal government, because they were going to remove the Choctaws from southeastern Oklahoma to New Mexico. And they said enough is enough. We're going to end up in the Pacific Ocean before all said and done.
Well, it's also and to the point of that race played a part in it. It's nice to believe that the Confederacy would have been benevolent and benign, but I highly doubt they would have treated them any better than the North after the war had they won.
Well, keep in mind too that the states that they were removed from were southern states themselves. So,
no, they were southern. They were culturally southern.
So many of their neighbors who wanted them removed were Southerners.
Exactly.
So I'm not naive enough to say it couldn't have happened or it wouldn't have happened, but at least on paper, they had a better deal with the Confederacy. And we don't know what would have happened. And again, the Confederate government was a confederacy versus a central federal government. Who knows? I mean, but at least, like I said, on paper, they thought they were going to get a better deal, so that's why they went there.
Tell us about a couple of actual battles that happened in Oklahoma, because a lot of people don't know that part of the history.
Well, all in all, and I've seen different numbers, but there are some 80 to 90 engagements between North and South troops in what would become Oklahoma. The difference being is that, of course, they're smaller scale, because obviously there's not many people here. Whereas east of the Mississippi, you had hundreds of thousands of people. Well, here you had tens of thousands. But there were several battles that included thousands of troops. And just a few days ago, as a matter of fact, on July 17th was the anniversary of the largest single land battle fought in Oklahoma. And I say land battle because there is one kind of naval engagement, which
Let's
I'll
go
talk
that
about.
one next.
We'll talk about that in a second. But about 9,000 troops were involved, 6,000 Confederates and 3,000 federal forces, and it sometimes is called the Gettysburg of Indian Territory because it's the high water mark of the Confederacy here. Douglas Cooper led the Confederate Indians against Confederate Indians and Texas troops against the Kansas troops, the Colorado troops, the Wisconsin troops, the Northern Indian troops, which there were at this battle, and it was a Northern victory. And from that point on, it became more of a guerrilla warfare in what would become Oklahoma. Not the last battle fought here. There was two other major battles that were fought here, but that was the last big land battle.
Interesting. Now, I mean, that was awesome, but you immediately piqued my interest. We had a naval battle here?
Well, and I use that kind of sparingly. Where I live now, and I heard one of your earlier podcasts, I know Cass talked about it, I'm sure he picked it up from me.
Port of Catoosa?
Port of Catoosa.
Hey, and you picked that up from me.
You can actually hop a boat at Catoosa in South Rogers County, hop a boat and go anywhere in the world without touching land.
This guy.
Yeah,
I've been hearing that since I was a child.
But it's true.
It's true. No, it's absolutely true.
And in 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s, that same waterway was available. And so steamboats would come up from the Arkansas and the Red River and come up from the Gulf and come up from further north and have trade. So one of the ways that the federal forces would supply themselves were boats up the Arkansas River, full of supplies, guns, munitions, things of that nature. And in 1864, and I apologize, the month, I think it's spring, late summer.
How dare you not have that specific information?
I know.
How dare you?
But Stan Wadey, which I'm sure we'll get to talk about here in a little while, and his troops waited on the banks of a place called Pleasant or Pheasant Bluff. And as a steamship came by, the J.R. Williams, they had artillery. They fired at the ship, disabled it, and was able to capture the ship or the boat. It's I'm not a nautical guy, but I'm sure it's a boat. Captured the boat on the Arkansas River and took all the supplies from it, burned it, and then it's lost evermore. I will tell you a side story. Years ago, when I would travel across Oklahoma to all these Civil War sites, I tried to go find the place in the Arkansas River, and I didn't look at the maps well enough to realize now that it's the Kerr Reservoir, so it's all the river is now gone. It's now a giant lake. But I did get to the bluff, and I was able to look down at the lake as to where the river was. But that's kind of our naval engagement.
Interesting. That's very interesting.
I'd never heard that before.
Yeah.
I don't remember hearing that.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of other firsts, too, in Oklahoma. Again, when I say Oklahoma, I know it wasn't a state then, but the Indian Territory would become Oklahoma. It's a microcosm of the war in general because we had Indian troops, we had African American troops, we had white troops, both northern and southern from all over the West. And it's kind of a debate whether it happened in Oklahoma or back east in Virginia, but there was a black unit, they were called colored units back then, called the 54th Massachusetts. And they are credited with being the first black regiment that fought in the war, and they did this on July 16th, 1863.
On the side of the Union?
On the side of the Union. However, on that same day, at almost the same exact time, the 1st Kansas Colored, that's what they were called, federal, the Yankee unit, had their first engagement right here in what would become Oklahoma. So it's always been kind of debate whether who's actually first. I think the 54 Massachusetts is a little more famous, so they get to do that. But First Kansas Color definitely played an important part in the Battle of Honey Springs and actually won the day for the North, but based upon what happened. But so that's another first. For
Can't
us.
imagine they're still called that today.
No,
Is
no.
the first Kansas unit still a thing?
No. I mean, they integrated years and years ago, but at that time, they were not integrated.
Right.
Do you think our army is still segregated?
No, I don't think it's still segregated. I'm sure the 54th Massachusetts is still a thing, though.
Okay.
Well, when they redid the armies, many of the old regiments were changed. For example, the 45th Division, which is famous from Oklahoma, and for you older guys, Willie and Joe fame, it's now called the Thunderbirds. And it's now more of a National Guard unit, but at one time it was a very famous unit that helped Patton in World War II fight his way across Germany during the Battle of the Bulge and so on.
Dash in the fash, I like it.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's another first for out here, far out in the West, and Oklahoma, like I said, had 80 some engagements. Battles were fought out further west. New Mexico has a couple of major battles. I don't know if you ever remember the movie The Good and the Bad and the Ugly. With Clint
I think I saw it a long time ago, yeah.
Well, I mean, as much as that's kind of a fictional event, the battle that they depict there, because it takes place during the war between the states, is based upon a real battle that was fought in New Mexico, and they use the generals' real names on each side and the colonel's real name on each side, so that's kind of interesting. A little bit of kind of real history. So, so there was a lot of battles fought here, a lot of them that helped shape what would become Oklahoma.
Well, our talk about the Confederacy kind of brings me to another question I wanted to ask of you. I have a lot of questions, but when Cass first described you, he described, well, I guess not you as physically or overall, but he described you politically as one of the only people you know of that can defend both the Confederate flag and the necessity of Black Lives Matter as a social movement in the same sentence.
Absolutely.
This is going to be on the air, and I allowed it to happen.
Yeah, well, I have to hear this perspective.
Well, the Confederate flag, as much as it's maligned now, is a part of our history, and I am enough of a historian, amateur historian, although I've been involved with history and doing things with history for forever, but it is part of our history, and I think it's a shame that we're seeing reactionary events taking place to take down statues.
Cash just twitched.
I know, to take down memorabilia.
Statues that were built during integration in the 60s, but whatever.
Not all.
I thought most of them were made in Reconstruction.
No, actually, most of them were made in the 1890s.
You weren't the ones being taken down.
No, well, that again, we can debate each particular statue.
No, we know when the statues were built. That's not lost to history.
I mean, we're not looking at the figures in front of us right now. So
continue.
But what it does, whether it was built in 1960 or 1860, the fact of the matter is, it's depicting historical events that took place. And
celebrating historical events that took place.
And I know you won't appreciate this, being the left wing guy that you are, but
it's being anti-slavery. It's not a left or right wing.
No. This is anti-statuary. So that's what you're being. But here's the thing: a lot of these statues help bring in money to local places because people come see these things. How many battlefields were you dragged to as a kid?
Yeah, but they weren't celebrating the Confederacy. They were historical
I
markers.
think that gets into a debate on whether statues themselves are always celebratory or if some of them are in fact depictions. I mean, there are some horrific statues in Europe that are just depictions.
Can you please talk about Black Lives Matter so people think
I think we're on something here. Here. I don't think anyone could have listened to that and got the impression your dad is evil. I think they got the impression that he's a history buff.
He's extremely wrong, not evil.
To Cass's 5 leftist friends listening to this, I guess.
Well,
think
Black
he's wrong.
Lives Matter, and I think you guys know this, and I'll say this. I'm an attorney, and I do a lot of criminal defense work, and there are good guys and bad guys on both sides of the aisle on this thing. But there is a horrible situation. And it's not just with African Americans, but it's with a lot of people where, unfortunately, because of the situation they're in, people get killed. And many times it is a reaction to what are the perceptions by certain people as to what's taking place. And the bottom line is, it is important that we stand up and not just say, well, one side's wrong because of who they are, what they do, or right because of who they are and what they do. So Black Lives Matter is extremely important because they do matter, and I know all lives matter, and I get that. But we do have a history in this country of sometimes institutional racism to downright slavery, and that's what the Civil War we're talking about, and that was against the African Americans. And there has been a long-standing problem in the country with racism. Now, when I say racism, I'm talking about political and law aspects of it. I'm talking about bigotry. There's always going to be that. You're always going to have people who don't like people because they're different. And I think a lot of it's fear, and a lot of it's ignorance, and a lot of it is poor training. But I do think it's important that we understand that there is a problem. And again, we can discuss the issues in the black community and in lower income communities that are not black, and those issues are going to be there that help cause the situations and problems. And so, yeah, Black Lives Matter I think is an important movement that we need to pay attention to, and then I can support what the concept of it is without any difficulty at all.
Very, very, very interesting.
I feel better.
Yeah.
Gee, well, I'm glad I have your approval. It makes my day.
We're all just craving for Cass's approval all the time.
Yes, this is. I'm Alan Combs, and I'm happy to be here on the show.
Yes.
And
whatever you say, Hannity.
Yeah.
Whatever you say, Hannity. Well, I guess you're right.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Combs. I want to get back to that. You got heated for a second there. I find it interesting that you see statues specifically as celebratory. Would you not acknowledge that they are educational or informative in any context, or do you think
some statues are? But the statues that are being taken down, the statues we're talking about now, were built in direct refutation of integration in the 50s, 40s.
So that's the criteria, the context. For
there are
celebratory.
Some monuments, Civil War monuments, that shouldn't be taken down because they are purely historical. They are not. They are reverent. But these statues that there's this one, and I don't know who it's of. But it looks like it was a lot of these statues were mass produced in order to let black people know that these neighbors and these neighborhoods and these towns don't belong to you, and we don't want you here. And they were put in places where they would be inflammatory.
Now, I'm going to interrupt you there. You have. I know you don't have it with you now, and I don't expect you to, but you have documentation that those statutes were put there just for that purpose.
Yes.
Okay. Well, then how come they've taken down the statue of Robert E. Lee in New Orleans?
I don't know about this specific statue being taken.
Well, I'm going to tell you about this specific statue. Robert E. Lee, who was the most famous Confederate probably of all time, even more famous than Jefferson Davis. And by the way, Jefferson Davis was very much in favor of slavery. Again, there's no question about that. But Robert E. Lee was not.
But he still fought for the nation. Robert
E. Lee. Well, we'll get to that in a second. If you really want to debate that issue, we will. But Robert E. Lee joined the Confederacy because of Virginia and no other reason.
Yeah, that's a bad reason.
And the Virginia, and I should have
states were a lot bigger deal back then.
I should have said this at the beginning. During the war between the states and the Civil War, especially in the South, but also in the North, each state, and this is true with the Indian tribes here and the Indian nations here in Oklahoma, joined the war for different reasons. Missouri did not join the war the same reason that Texas did, and they did not join the war the same reason Virginia did. So they all had their own different reasons for doing it. Again, slavery is so entrenched in the war. Yes, it's part of it. There's no question about it. But what was Lincoln really trying to do when he became president in 1860? Was he really trying to do away with slavery directly? The answer is no.
No, and he's quoted as having said, "In order to preserve the Union, I would."
I get that. No, I'm not. I won't even say that. We don't even need to go there. What was he trying to do? He was trying to stop the expansion of slavery to the new developing territories that would become states. Why was he doing this? Was it for social reasons? Maybe. I don't believe so. Or was it for political reasons? It was for political reasons. Why? Because he knew that if these states, such as New Mexico, Arizona, eventually Oklahoma, Kansas, because they weren't a state really in 1860, Nebraska, Colorado, all these others that would become states, if they came into the Union as free states, they would think politically like the northern states. We had a flip of the parties. What was Lincoln? He was the very first Republican. So back then,
irrelevant for. Well, I mean, I get it's interesting.
Yeah, and so that's just a side note that the parties have just totally flipped as far as how they think, or how they're perceived, I should say. But Lincoln did not want the expansion of slavery for political reasons. Now, granted, excuse me, I think the main reason the war was fought from the North was to preserve the Union. I really do believe. Now, there is a strong number of abolitionists, and if we have time, we can talk about where the war really started.
I see a different element of Cass when he's debating this with his father. I can tell by watching this that these have probably been argued several times before.
Yes, that's it. It's kind of a Wantland tradition. My dad, my mom, and
yell at people about the Civil War.
Yell at people about all kinds of things.
How many lawyers are there in the family?
Too many.
Well, let's see. Cass's brother's an attorney here in Edmond. His mom and dad were attorneys up in Claremore. His grandfather, my father, is a retired Supreme Court Justice of the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. He's an attorney. He's got a cousin who's attorney here in Edmond. So
it's like peeling back an onion, Cass.
Yeah.
It just makes so much sense.
I'm glad I'm fascinated.
You are. Cass is it's like a fish in a tank. I'm just learning more every day. Well, where were we on that? I know you wanted to wrap that up real quick so we could get to our little fun segment, but I was enjoying watching this father-son debate sesh.
Well, let me just quickly throw this in there, and this kind of goes to what Cass does believe, and that the war was fought for slavery and against slavery.
No, that's not what I believe. I don't believe the war was fought for the noble purpose of freeing the slaves. It was the outcome.
Well, okay. Now,
whatever we have hindsight, so we know that the correct moral side is the North.
Well, no, because who freed the slaves first, the South or the North?
I actually don't know this.
The answer is the Southern states, because the Confederate Congress actually freed the slaves prior to 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment of the United States.
What?
Yes.
All of the slaves?
All the slaves.
So
they were freed. Of course, it was late in the war, and does it matter or not? I don't know. But let's talk about right quick where the war actually started. The first official government actions were done in South Carolina at Fort Sumter between the forces of the Confederacy that bombarded the fort and the Union forces that tried to resupply it. That's April of 1861. However, in the 1850s, again going back to the expansion question, you had what was called Bleeding Kansas, where you had slavers coming from Missouri to try to make Kansas a slave state. And people in Kansas, such as John Brown, the infamous or famous person
Love me some John Brown.
who went to Harper's Ferry in Virginia, now West Virginia, and tried to free the guns there to give to the slaves to do a slave revolt.
For all of those leftists who listen in, John Brown Gun Club does have a chapter here in Oklahoma City. Sign up, arm up, and protect yourself and your community. Sorry, go ahead, Dad.
I didn't think liberals owned guns.
I'm not a liberal. Stop saying I'm a liberal.
I didn't think left-wing people owned
Leftists
guns.
like guns.
Leftists love guns.
They like it for their
How
nefarious
else can we
purposes.
start a revolution?
Okay, all right. Well, very good.
I support it. I don't support anything else about the John Brown Gun Club aside from the fact that they want guns.
They want guns, okay.
Which is fine.
But anyway, so the war actually, the shooting between the factions actually started in Kansas. I know it's not Oklahoma, but it's right north of here. And then the war actually ended. The last Confederate general to stop hostilities is Brigadier General Stan Wadey of the Cherokee fame, who was the only general on either side that was non-white. And he laid down his arms in 1865 near Fort Towson in Dokesville down in southeastern Oklahoma. So the war, you can say, started at this part of the world and ended in this part of the world. So
Interesting.
I have no misconception that the war was fought for altruistic reasons. The United States has never waged an altruistic war, but we know that there are some reasons that wars have been just.
Well,
Okay, World War II.
World War II, we were good guys.
We were unequivocally the good guys.
We were the good guys in World War II. We just had the devil. We had the devil on our side. But
I like Korea and Vietnam. Any war that stops communism, I'm a fan of.
Fine, but there was.
We didn't need to be in any of those.
Vietnam was a battle that probably didn't need to be fought. And again, stopping communism, I'm not against, but a battle that probably didn't need to be fought that way in a much larger conflict during that time period, the Cold War in general, and specifically Vietnam was part of that. I mean, that's clearly. Again, and we lost Vietnam, unfortunately, so we did lose it. So we should have done something different, in my humble opinion.
We should have let MacArthur rampage his way all the way across the parallel. We should have let him stonewall all the way down.
And with that, we're going to move on to our final, most fun segment. No, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I'm your guest. You asked me if there's anything I should to tell you.
Chandler?
We'll talk about that off mic. I feel like we were about to have a moment. We brought it up last episode, and we'll probably add some more segments, kind of like this, some more fun segments. We like to say and determine what is the political ideology or what political party would our favorite fictional characters belong to. And we did Captain America last time, but Captain America being Tim's favorite, we wanted to hear your take on what Captain America would be.
Today, Captain America, or Captain America of 1960? So you need
both.
Both?
60s first.
60s is when you were reading comics, correct?
60s, 70s, and 80s.
So it's a different character entirely.
Totally different Captain America's long before Civil Wars. And I'm not talking the movie, I'm talking about the comic book series. What political party would it have been? Probably a Democrat, because he was an FDR person, and FDR was the president when he went into his deep freeze, and so when he woke up, it would have been after Kennedy's assassination, so it would have been Johnson. So he would have been a Democrat then. I don't think he would ever become a Republican at all. I think he'd have stayed Democrat for different reasons, though, throughout the decades.
Do you think he'd be a blue dog, or do you think he'd be a progressive Democrat?
He wouldn't be progressive. I would say he would be a libertarian. Mm-hmm. He'd be a libertarian kind of guy.
Blue dog. All right.
But if you had, I mean, if we're talking just Democrat and Republican, I mean, I think he'd be a libertarian Democrat.
Oh, there's a good one. All right. Doctor Strange. Tim, your thoughts first.
Strange. Oh my goodness.
Did you read a lot of Doctor Strange growing up?
He's a doctor. Yeah. He's a doctor, so he would have had money. He'd have been a Republican.
I think so too.
I think so too, because he was a Republican.
Yeah.
He was a doctor with money.
Yeah, he was a doctor with money, so he'd have been a Republican.
And on top of that, just like the whole way that he operates, protecting from threats, proactive action. Yeah. I mean, he just.
Well, he's very self-interested too. He's not a doctor for any altruistic reason. I've used that word too much today. But
that's okay.
Yeah. So Republican.
Star-Lord.
Star-Lord. He wouldn't be in a party.
I don't think so either.
He's a party guy.
He would get back here, and he'd obsess over Kevin Bacon for 2 years, and then he'd try to catch up.
Watch some Cheers, and I'd be done with it. Yeah.
Okay. Cheers. This is a good little list. All right. Superman. I don't think we actually went over Supes.
This is a big one. This could be an entire episode on its own.
He's changed so much. Like now, he's like so center of the world.
Are we talking Superman from the 30s or Superman now?
Well, let's talk let's split the difference. Let's say like 60s, 70s. Not the Superman from the beginning, and also not the one who renounces American citizenship.
Okay.
Right in the middle.
Right in the middle.
60s, 70s.
60s and. I can
see many different factors going into play.
I would tell you he probably would be a Democrat simply because of his alter ego was a reporter, and they tend to go to the Democratic Party.
And he's an immigrant. Were immigrants at the time going for the Democrats or the Republicans?
I don't think, though, like the fact that him being an immigrant, yes, he's an immigrant, but like, I mean, he didn't know it for a super long time. And he didn't look the part. He was raised like by like American people. He didn't have the immigrant experience.
Take that approach to writing his character.
That he didn't have the immigrant experience?
No, that he does have the immigrant experience.
Interesting.
Because he's so different from everyone else.
Well, I think that comes about later in the comic books.
It does. No, it's not.
I think in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and again when I was reading from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and although I'm a Marvel guy, I did read DC as well.
As you do.
Yeah.
There's love for everybody here.
All right.
I even read some Gold Key superhero comic books, so there you go.
Absolute nonsense.
Well, and going over another one that we've done, we're just firing through the ones that we've done before because I want to hear Tim's perspective. Batman.
Republican.
Yep, we agreed on that one.
Republican. I mean, millionaire. He's going to...
Billionaire.
Well, billionaire, yeah. But back when I started, he was a millionaire when I was reading it, so...
Okay, and here's one that seems fairly obvious to me, but someone has a different take on it. Luke Cage.
Well, the easy answer is Democrat. I'm trying to think of his backstory. The original Luke Cage, again, for you youngsters, Luke Cage did not start out with superpowers. Keep that in mind.
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that either.
He was just a tough guy?
He was a private investigator.
Wow!
And he got the Power Man powers, the same ones that Wonder Man and Power Man had. Power Man being the bad guy, Wonder Man being kind of in between. And Wonder Man comes back from the dead later and becomes an Avenger. But Luke Cage started out as a private eye, so he might be a Democrat now, but I think then he would have been more of a Republican. He fit the mold more of a Republican because he's a law and order kind of guy.
Interesting.
Not that, and again, when I say that, I'm just using the generalities.
No, that's good because, I mean, all of the lore of the comic characters that we're aware of is later, so it's nice to have someone who read him in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Yeah, he was not a superhero in the sense of having superpowers at first.
Yeah, and I mean,
I didn't know that.
Wasn't his group even called Heroes for Hire for the longest time?
Yes,
Yeah,
that comes about
Iron
later.
Fist.
That comes about later. And for a while, he was a member of the Fantastic Four when Ben Grimm lost his powers.
Interesting.
So,
Heroes for Hire definitely not as altruistic as a lot of the other heroes.
That's the word of the day. Every time you hear it, drink.
All right, the Flash.
Which Flash? The original one?
The Flash of
My
your
Flash.
youth.
My Flash. Probably would have been a Republican.
Barry Allen?
Yeah, I think
He's a police. He was a cop.
He was a scientist guy that he worked in those, so he did that. So probably Republican. And again, we're talking 70s and 80s.
Interesting. What about, and we'll of course want to cast this guy on the other side, but what about the Joker?
Whoa.
I think he's an anarchist.
Well,
in the Green Party.
the original Joker was actually more like the Joker now. There was a time period when the Joker was kind of not benevolent, but not quite as bad. But when he first started out, back in the day when Batman first started, he was a cold-blooded killer, and then he later becomes that. So he, like Star-Lord, he probably wouldn't be anything at all. An anarchist is probably a good term for him. I don't know if he would actually vote. I don't know. The Joker that I know, which was the
Joker right now, we'll talk afterward about what's going on in the comics. You'll hate it. It's terrible. But there's three
People
different
still read
people.
DC?
Yeah. Yeah, DC's very popular. I mean, it hasn't been as popular as Marvel since the 70s, but anyway, I'll tell you after.
Yeah, no, the other
DC movies are
producer
awful.
brings up a good point. Yeah, I imagine their poor movie performance had nearly tanked the DC universe, but they do have more iconic characters.
Their comics are still pretty good.
Well, and I would say their TV shows are probably better than Marvel's TV shows.
DC TV shows are better than Marvel TV shows.
I liked Green Arrow.
And again,
Daredevil's so good.
Supergirl's fun.
Well,
The first season of Daredevil, but the second season
The Punisher
is just a
was
waste
so
of time.
good.
I haven't seen The Punisher yet.
And I haven't seen the Punisher. I saw the Punisher when he was in the Daredevil series, and of course I saw the Defenders series. By the way, not the original Defenders.
Who is the original? Are you going to quiz me?
Yeah, who's the original Defenders?
The original lineup of the Defenders is Doctor Strange, Hulk, Silver Surfer, and Namor. Oh, Silver Surfer came later.
Yeah, Submariner, those three.
He came later in the same way Captain America is not an original.
I thought
that's
Beast
true.
was at one time a member of the Defenders.
I'm sure he has.
No, Beast was an Avengers at one time, and then
Okay.
then there was another group called the Champions, and I can't remember who all was in that. Ghost Rider, and I think Iceman from the X-Men, and Hercules, who was an Avenger.
C-listers, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's switch fandoms here. Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Obi-Wan Kenobi, Democrat.
I see that too.
Although, in modern party affiliation, you tend to think that the Republicans are more religious because of the religious faction in the Republican Party. And Obi-Wan is
He's a
very
religious
religious
zealot,
guy,
yeah.
so
Yeah.
maybe he'd be Republican.
It's very possible.
Yeah.
I like to think of the original trilogy as a good. I'll talk about it some other episode. It's not important. We'll cut that out. So
We might. I'm pretty lazy. You never know what I'm going to cut out, what I'm going to leave in. Let's bring up my boy, Sheev. Let's talk about Palpatine for a minute.
that's the Emperor.
Yes, I know.
Okay.
The only man who can do a 920 spin from a prone position. Which is impressive.
Gosh, I mean, since the Empire is supposed to be evil, I say he's going to be a communist.
Yeah, I'd agree.
But he's not. The Empire is specifically fascist. He'd have been a Nazi.
Well, no, because they were never called the evil empire, whereas the Soviet Union was. I'm just talking about if you use by the actual name. Again, I'm not saying that Nazis are better than communists or communists are better than Nazis.
I would say they weren't fascist either, because fascist, whether for good or for bad, was a movement based around the people, not a movement based around the imperial system. Like,
it was based around the individual. That's what makes fascism unique. But
right, but
that's another episode.
The Empire was not that. The Empire was definitely from the top down in Palpatine's control. I mean,
it's really not.
You could say it's fascistic, but I would not say it's...
Okay, I would say it's fascistic. There's a great video I'll send you later. But there's a YouTuber named Lindsay Ellis. She has a great video about fascism and Star Wars, and I recommend everyone look it up. Again,
Is
it's
she
Lindsay
the one,
Ellis on YouTube.
Is she the one you're always showing?
That's a different person.
Okay.
This person reviews nerd stuff. So.
Okay. Cass has this person that he shows me who does rebuttals. She's actually pretty well spoken and makes good points, even though I never agree with her. So, Cass has a lot of interesting YouTube videos. Let's hop fandoms one more time. Anyone open? We've done Star Trek. We've done Star Wars. We've done Marvel,
let's do someone
DC.
who
Done Lord of the Rings.
He wouldn't be a Republican or a Democrat. He'd be in the Labor Party or he'd be a Tory. Let's talk James Bond.
Okay, once again, which decade Bond?
Let's go with Sean Connery, classic.
Okay,
Brexiteer all the way.
Yeah,
Well,
he would be Tory.
He'd be a Tory?
He'd be Tory.
All right. What about Daniel Craig?
Labor Party, I think.
Labor Party, yeah.
All right.
But I was thinking Bond from the books, actually.
Okay, Bond from the books. You've read all the books.
Yeah. Then they start in the 1950s, so they would be staunch anti-communist, staunch anti-German, meaning Nazis. Is
I know
what
what
I
you
mean
mean,
by
I know
that.
what you mean.
Well, I better say it because we've got Germans in the family and
So many Germans.
Germans in the family, but
Can't do anything about
sorry.
it. They're lovely people.
but yeah, so very staunch pro-British. So probably
They'd have been in love with Margaret Thatcher.
a Plantagenet. that's what they would be.
You're my dad.
Yeah.
Well, let's hop fandoms one more time. Dr. Emmett Brown from Back to the Future.
I don't know if he would even take the time to vote.
I don't think so either.
He would, of course, I remember him from Taxi fame and other things. Star Trek movie, by the way. Did you all know that he was a Klingon in the Star Trek movie?
No, I didn't know that.
No, not Undiscovered Country. Search for Spock.
This first one. He was the bad guy that when Spock died. So
I do think that in Back to the Future, I mean, he's definitely very free market. Didn't he buy nuclear material off of the Libyans?
Yeah, he did.
Well, I mean, bought, quotation marks, they tried to come in and kill him.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it, what am I talking about? If you haven't seen it, you're 35 years late.
All of the Ghostbusters, and there is a correct answer to this.
All of the
first.
All right,
four,
the male
first four.
Ghostbusters,
The male
not the
Ghostbusters.
female Ghostbusters.
The real Ghostbusters.
They're all real Ghostbusters. They're just some of them are good Ghostbusters, and some of them are bad movies.
Now, I will tell you that I like the girl one, and
That's
that's
not good. It's a waste of a concept, and it's a waste of a cast.
I love the cast, and I love the movie. It's just more Ghostbusters.
I love the cast. I just didn't love the movie.
Yeah. Gosh, I never thought about that. Well, they were all in college. They were all professors. So they got to be Democrats.
No. They started a small business. They left
that was later. They would have been registered Democrats while they were working.
That's
while they were
fair.
professors.
They fought the EPA.
The
EPA was the villain.
They
in that
did
movie.
later,
They are
but
Republicans.
at the beginning they were.
I worked in the private sector.
Yeah,
They expect results.
Yeah, expect results. So
that movie's very pro Reagan.
Yeah. Well, it was the '84, so of course it was. It was still the era of Reagan.
God bless Reagan. We know you're looking down on us.
You're looking up at us.
Oh.
Anyway,
Is he even your son? I really don't understand.
Well,
He got the neocon out of his older son.
I mean,
so he got the.
He looks like you, but did you guys swap the babies at the hospital or something?
No. I think it's just rebelling against common sense and.
Somewhere out there are 2 Berkeley professors who have a neocon son that they just hate. So that exists.
Far from a neocon, and then what's Watson?
He's 19.
Okay,
so.
Fair enough. Hi, little brother. You're never going to listen to this. Hi, big brother. You do listen. Thank you.
Aw.
Yeah, he does.
Shut up. Well, Tim, we really appreciate you coming on. This was great. We'll have to do it again sometime whenever you're in town again.
I can't wait for my next aneurysm. I'm looking forward to it. No, thanks for being on.
Well, it was a pleasure, and anytime I can come down here and you guys want me to talk about anything I know about, or even if I don't know about it, I'll make it up.
Quantum physics.
I can make that up real well.
Yeah.
Tune in a couple of weeks. We'll have Tim back on to talk about quantum physics.
Yes.
All right, thank you, everyone. We are signing out. We will see you on Monday.